were calculated to purchase the city's loyalty. Philip never worried about breaking his word. Why should he sheepishly honor his agreements when he knew the Athenians would find some excuse later on to extend their outposts to the north at his expense? Trust is not a matter of ethics. It is another maneuver. Philip saw trust and friendship as qualities for sale. He would buy them from Athens later on when he was powerful and had things to offer it in exchange. Like Philip, you must see any negotiating situation in which your vital interests are at stake as a realm of pure maneuver, warfare by other means. Earning people's trust and confidence is not a moral issue, but a strategic one. Sometimes it is necessary, sometimes it isn't. People will break their word if it serves their interests, and they will find any moral or legal excuse to justify their moves, sometimes to themselves as well as to others. Just as you must always put yourself in the strongest position before battle, so it is with negotiation. If you are weak, use negotiations to buy yourself time, to delay battle until you are ready. Be conciliatory, not to be nice, but to maneuver. If you are strong, take as much as you can before and during negotiations. Then later you can give back some of what you took, conceding the things you least value to make yourself look generous. Do not worry about your reputation or about creating distrust. It is amazing how quickly people will forget your broken promises when you are strong and in a position to offer them something in their self-interest. From The Prince by Niccolo Machiavelli. Therefore, a prudent ruler ought not to keep faith, when by so doing it would be against his interest. If men were all good, this precept would not be a good one. But as they are bad, and would not observe their faith with you, so you are not bound to keep faith with them. Nor have legitimate grounds ever failed a prince who wished to show colorable excuse for the non-fulfillment of his promise. Jade for Tile. Early in 1821, the Russian foreign minister, Kapodistria, heard news he had long been awaiting. A group of Greek patriots had begun a rebellion against the Turks. Greece was then part of the Ottoman Empire, aiming to throw them out and establish a liberal government. Distria, a Greek nobleman by birth, had long dreamed of involving Russia in Greek affairs. Russia was a growing military power. By supporting the revolution, assuming the rebels won, it would gain influence over an independent Greece and Mediterranean ports for its navy. The Russians also saw themselves as the protectors of the Greek Orthodox Church, and Tsar Alexander I was a deeply religious man. Leading a crusade against the Islamic Turks would satisfy his moral consciousness as well as Russian political interests. It was all too good to be true. Only one obstacle stood in Distria's way. Prince Clemens von Metternich, the Austrian foreign minister. A few years earlier, Metternich had brought Russia into an alliance with Austria and Prussia called the Holy Alliance. Its goal was to protect these nations' governments from the threat of revolution and to maintain a peace in Europe after the turmoil of the Napoleonic Wars. Metternich had befriended Alexander I. Sensing that the Russians might intervene in Greece, he had sent the Tsar hundreds of reports claiming that the revolution was part of a Europe-wide conspiracy to get rid of the continent's monarchies. If Alexander came to Greece's aid, he would be the revolutionaries' dupe and would be violating the purpose of the Holy Alliance. Distria was no fool. He knew that what Metternich really wanted was to prevent Russia from expanding its influence in the Mediterranean, which would upset England and destabilize Europe, Metternich's greatest fear. To Distria, it was simple. He and Metternich were at war over who would have ultimate influence over the Tsar, and Distria had the advantage. He saw the Tsar often and could counteract Metternich's persuasive powers through constant personal contact. The Turks inevitably moved to suppress the Greek rebellion, and as their atrocities against the Greeks mounted, it seemed almost certain that the Tsar would intervene. But in February 1822, as the revolution was reaching a boiling point, the Tsar made what, in Distria's eyes, was a fatal mistake. He agreed to send an envoy to Vienna to discuss the crisis with Metternich. The prince loved to lure negotiators to Vienna, where he would charm them to death. Distria felt the situation slipping out of his hands. Now he had just one option: to choose the envoy who would go to Vienna and brief him in detail. Distria's choice was a man called Tatishev, who had been Russia's ambassador to Spain. Tatishev was a shrewd, experienced negotiator. Called in for a meeting shortly before he was to leave, he listened carefully as Distria laid out the dangers. Metternich would try to charm and seduce Tatishev. To prevent the Tsar from intervening, he would offer to negotiate a settlement between the Russians and Turks. And of course, he would call for a European conference to discuss the issue. This last was Metternich's favorite ploy. He was always able to dominate these conferences and somehow get what he wanted. Tatishev was not to fall under his spell. He was to give Metternich a note from Distria, arguing that Russia had a right to come to the aid of fellow Christians suffering at the hands of the Turks. And on no account was he to agree to Russia's participation in a conference. On the eve of his departure for Vienna, Tatishev was unexpectedly called in for a meeting with the Tsar himself. Alexander was nervous and conflicted. Unaware of Distria's instructions, he told Tatishev to tell Metternich that he wanted both to act in accordance with the alliance and to meet his moral obligation in Greece. Tatishev decided he would have to delay giving this message as long as he could. It would make his work far too confusing. In his first meeting with Metternich in Vienna, Tatishev took measure of the Austrian minister. He saw him as rather vain, apparently more interested in fancy dress balls and young girls than in Greece. Metternich seemed detached and somewhat ill-informed. The little he said about the situation in Greece betrayed confusion. Tatishev read Distria's note to him, and, as if without thinking, Metternich asked if these were the Tsar's instructions as well. Put on the spot, Tatishev could not lie. His hope now was that the Tsar's rather contradictory instructions would further confuse the prince, letting Tatishev stay one step ahead. In the days to come, Tatishev had a splendid time in the delightful city of Vienna. Then, he had another meeting with Metternich, who asked him if they could begin negotiations based on the instructions of the Tsar. Before Tatishev could think, Metternich next asked what Russia's demands might be in this situation. That seemed fair, and Tatishev replied that the Russians wanted to make Greece a protectorate state, to get the alliance's approval for Russian intervention in Greece, on and on. Metternich turned down every proposal, saying his government would never agree to such things, so Tatishev asked him to suggest alternate ideas. Instead, Metternich launched into an abstract discussion of revolution, of the importance of the Holy Alliance, and other irrelevancies. Tatishev left confused and rather annoyed. He had wanted to stake out a position, but these discussions were informal and shapeless. Feeling lost, he had been unable to steer them in the direction he wanted. A few days later, Metternich called Tatishev in again. He looked uncomfortable, even pained. The Turks, he said, had just sent him a note claiming that the Russians were behind the trouble in Greece and asking him to convey to the Tsar their determination to fight to the death to hold on to what was theirs. In solemn tones, suggesting that he was angry at the Turks' lack of diplomacy, Metternich said he thought it beneath his country's dignity to pass this disgraceful message to the Tsar. He added that the Austrians considered Russia their staunchest ally and would support Russia's conditions for resolving the crisis. Finally, if the Turks refused to concede, Austria would break off relations with them. Tatishev was quite moved by this sudden emotional display of solidarity. Perhaps the Russians had misread the prince. Perhaps he was really on their side. Fearing that Distria would misunderstand, Tatishev reported this meeting to the Tsar alone. A few days later, Alexander responded that from now on, Tatishev was to report only to him. Distria was to be excluded from the negotiations.